which magazine.
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry.
But basically, she in this interview talks a lot about nothing, while like she basically positions herself as somebody that is she's like, I did a jeans commercial because I love jeans, but she doesn't talk about the political side of that, which I think, it's in itself, it speaks volume. Um and yeah, I mean, I don't know really much. I mean, I just kind of wanted to spark a conversation if anyone else knew more about it, if anyone had an opinion. But I think it's interesting to note.
Uh, yeah. And also the way, I mean, exactly the way that the sort of right wing sort of digital culture has then like, I'm not sure how much she's encouraged it or whether she was picked up by the right wing as like something that yeah, as a
Well,
figure
she's
that matters in this way now. Yeah.
yeah, she's for sure in the like a Trump supporter. I mean, you could it's been posted online and through her family, and it's something that she doesn't speak on up front about, but it's something that it's dangerous that you're not speaking about it. If you're proud about it, why aren't you talking more? It's like almost like she had this PR like crisis management like meeting before she did this interview, where she basically, if you look up Sydney Sweeney interview about the jeans ad, you'll see that she talks about, it's interesting. She's kind of just sitting there kind of like on her own little, I don't know. She's looking at this interviewer, saying nothing, speaking.
Mm.
I don't know how to describe
So,
it.
like she's not disassociating herself from the obvious kind of subtext. That's, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
fascinating. So, uh, metapolitics between pages 4 and 5 is kind of defined. That's right at the beginning. So we can sort of define that and work with it a little bit if we want to. But Michael, go for it. Jump
Well,
in.
I was just going to add to, I don't know Sydney Sweeney hardly at all, but judging from the image and within the Society of the Spectacle, this seems to be a role model for the women around Trump. This is the type, if we could put it that way, almost archetypical type that plays into the alt-right's fantasies at best, right? And in some ways. So I think this is important to keep in mind how Christy Noam, Pam Bondi has the similar kind of look, a little meaner. If you go through the list of, Caroline Levitt, who Joan Baez called her a puppet of privilege, right? When she told Joan Baez she's just a singer. So I think it's important again to see this, the spectacle as images, the society of the spectacle in the Debordian sense, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, is playing out here in terms of the kind of material background, if you will, or a new kind of masculinity, right? A kind of retreat to a previous 50s masculinity, right? Et cetera, without, at least in my opinion, because I grew up with Mansfield, Monroe, these were the stars of that period. And this is very different, a very different kind of look, much more biopolitical look too, from everything from Botox to all the body work. So I just wanted to add that to, this in terms of the microfascism, and that, Jack Bratich takes a lot of his research from Theodor Adorno's male fantasies, in a sense, and how this plays out very well to this new right formation. Yeah. I mean, it's much deeper, of course, but I'm just saying on the surface and, for filmic purposes. Whereas on the other hand, a very good essay, I want to go see the movie this week because, first of all, I like her ability. The Jennifer Lawrence film is not somebody that the alt-right is going to take up as a model. In fact, they're going to diss this film, definitely. We already know this, even though it's gotten tremendous amount of, publicity. So, Jennifer Lawrence becomes kind of the antithesis of this kind of actress, I think, to my mind, in terms of, the popular Hollywood, big money kind of culture in cinema, in current cinema. So just my little 2 cents here. Yeah.
Interesting to think about along the way. Yeah, the sort of society of the spectacle thing, the simulacra, the way that a fantasy is made reality, or the way that a fantasy is attempted to be made reality. I think is really interesting, given the way that Jack talks about autogenetic sovereignty, and the importance of this like ability to call into to call these kinds of fantasies into reality. I think is really interesting. I'm just putting into the chat the link to the Internet Archive for Volume 2 of Male Fantasies. I can't quickly find the link for Volume 1, but if anybody wants to check it out, it is available for free. And Jack does lean on it quite a bit, I think. Michael, since we're started, Sophia pointed us towards an early part of the introduction. All that goes on before that, right, is Jack, as he does in the next chapter too, starts with a vignette, an act of violence, the reporting of which did not emphasize the gendered nature of the violence and the violent actor. And so he starts with Charlottesville, and with the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, and starts by saying that the Heather Heyer's killer had beaten his mother and was somebody who law enforcement was aware of for multiple acts of violence against his mother. And so he introduces the question that way of like, what is the role of gender and what is the role of culture in the sort of emergence of fascism? And it's just a page or two later that he talks about metapolitics, and then he gets into fascism as culture. And we talked last time a little bit about fascism as culture. And so, Michael, if you wanted to step in and talk about, help us kind of situate the way that Jack is approaching his study of fascism, and what's significant about his study, sort of in the larger discourse, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a very original work, and I don't say that about many stuff that comes out today. The reason being is that Jack is really breaking open many paradigms in terms of the study of fascism. I mean, we've had excellent studies of fascism in the Marxist tradition of Poulantzas on fascism and dictatorship, the relationship of political economy and capitalism to fascism. This is all part of a huge body of research, some of which is excellent, some of which is, middle tier, etc. On one hand, and the other is what he refers to, and I think this is excellent, how he refers to Alberto Toscano's work, who is a comrade of ours and, lives out by Leslie now. I think he's at Simon Fraser or at BC. I'm not sure. I think he's at one of the two of those. But anyway, where he says that the usual set of checklists, and this seems to be a tendency that happens in fascist studies, that checklists, analogies, or ideal types cannot do justice to the concrete history of fascism. So in some ways, this whole notion of how we make these lists of things, we almost have a laundry list. That's fascist. We use the term interchangeably, thinking that we have meaning for it. And Jack, in a certain way, has been able to destroy, if you will, in the positive sense of destruction, as in philosophy or in deconstruction, deconstructing the previous research to show its inadequacy. Right? And one of the inadequacies is this positivist approach that comes out all the time about it. And then secondly, he goes on to the lack in the great classical book, which I have here, Fascism by Robert Griffin, which is a collection of essays. It's one of the major handbooks that people use in academic studies of fascism. And this is on page, he talks about this, I think on page, where was it? He mentions Robert Griffin on page 6, I think it is. Yes, on page 6, where he says that, and Griffin is the one who actually brings up concepts, which I'm sure David will develop when I finish on elimination, restoration, renewal, that movement, and also eliminationism. But he goes in, the studies of the attempts by fascism and Nazism to engineer a subjective revolution as an integral part of their project to regenerate the nation. Make America great again really means make male masculinity great again. Make, kind of a false sense of virility great again. This is the whole attitude, and why I think that bringing up, and I'm going to have to look more at her work, Sydney Sweeney up earlier in the way, is kind of like, these become almost archetypical, mother-like figures of fascism in some ways, this kind of regression in a way to this type. So again, he's taking this on, and he's performing, I think, this exceptional scholarship by reviewing the traditions that have studied fascism, et cetera, to the point of where he's able to go beyond it. And I want to just point out one other point, that what Griffin does not do in most of the studies on fascism, and I think this is very important, is eliminate colonization and patriarchy. Very little studies, again, about patriarchal and colonization in the dominant studies of fascism in the academy. So he's really very good at taking this on as well. And he also talks about Griffin's attempt, and I think he expands on this. This is another thing that he does extremely well, that Bratich does extremely well, is that Griffin argues for an understanding of fascist culture as wholesale transformation of the world. This is on page 6 as well, of time-space coordinates, as well as the direction of human development. And again, this is important. How do you go forward with this, in a sense? And what he calls group puzzles, which is a term that actually Félix Guattari, is one of his masters, I think. I think, in a way, Jack is one of the few people who's done Guattari's work on madness and work on fascism and microfascism justice. To me, he really is following in this tradition of Deleuze and Guattari. So another thing, too, yes, this time space that does not look at the colonial project and colonialism and patriarchy, etc. Very, very important. The narrow frame of Western history, again. So looking at this much broader, in a sense, very important. And then he makes a move to Umberto Eco on page 8, with the notion of the Ur-fascism, which is the deep structure. This is, of course, a Germanic term. The deep structure of fascist tendencies in human history, right? It is not displaced. This is crucial to me. This is really, really insightful. It is not displaced by the modern or the modernist project, or only by Marinetti's futurism, but it was reconfigured as a state form. Very important to consider this. Reconfiguration as a state form. And then the notion of paleogenic ultranationalism, that Vola's fulcrum for understanding authority, right, is the state and not the nation. So this is the birth of the state as such, right, in some ways, that fascism has this. And this goes back, again, and I'm riffing on Jack's book. I don't want to complicate things too much, but this is also in the birth of biopolitics, of Foucault. A very, very good section in his early lectures on biopolitics. I mean, I'm not going to run back and forth the rooms to get the exact page number, but this is in his third lecture on the biopolitics, when he talks about Nazism as an Urstaat, right? In a way, fascism is an Urstaat. Very, very important again here. Yeah. And again, what he's really doing here, in my opinion, is after reviewing all this history, he's going to take up, I think, some of the best of, insights of post-Reich, mass psychology of fascism, post-Deleuze and Guattari, trying to basically orient us towards a completely new understanding, right, of fascism in everyday life. Not only fascism is exemplified by Trump and how easy it's to say it's a bunch of fascists in control, or to say the same thing about the Third Reich, but to look at fascism, right, in terms of everyday life and also as a state formation together. So state and everyday life become completely interrelated here in a way. And it's a shame our friend Bratich isn't here because he wrote a book, that takes its point of departure from Poulanças and Henri Lefebvre, Everyday Life in the State, right? in terms of describing some of this stuff. Yeah, I don't think he goes the way of Deleuze and Guattari or et cetera. And I also, again, he uses this term, again, to situate it. This is the 1970s at its best, in my opinion, which, to go back to Sophia being in Italy and obviously has some, I guess you have, judging from your last name, you Italian background a little bit, or, yeah. So anyway, the Italian cinema of the 1970s was amazing in its study of fascism and its relationship to personality. And one of the great films is Bertolucci's Il Conformista, The Conformist, right? And a film always worth looking at and re-looking at. And then, of course, the fascist fantasies, too, based on the Sade, right? In Salo of Pasolini, that most people walk out of or don't really study actively, as a document of this kind of microfascism and state form that knows no rules, right, going forward. So again, he's really on to this, and he has the the major characteristics. And again, to me, this is important in terms of situating. This is page 11, where he says, delves into the subjective realm that has three characteristics that are also qualifications. It takes place before, but really in excess of the state. This is crucial to understand, I think, for his project here. It exists in minds, but moreover, not only in minds, right? It's not this mental illness that we like to call it, or psychopathology only, but in desires, bodies, and practices. Something we completely forget. And of course, Reich, those of you that know Wilhelm Reich, is very good on the body and character armor, and that the body shows us the fascism of everyday life in many ways, and our comportment. And then thirdly, it is composed in culture, right, to create individual and collective actions with their own specific fascist results. So this is very, very, I think, very crucial, David, to really begin to understand where his definitions are and his breakthrough, if you will, out of the tradition articulated by Griffin, the Marxist tradition, of course, liberal democracy, which I think in some ways it's false to think that they're only reacting to Kamala Harris today and Joe Biden, which a lot of people like. It's the Democrats' fault. It's much deeper. Right? And Jack is really pointing this out, and we have this tendency to say, look, the Democrats didn't do anything, so this is why, Trump has come into power. I mean, that's a bourgeois way of looking at things, but in sense, it really, filters down so many places today when we speak about what's happening today. So I think also this is very important too in terms of temporality. The first feature defined by Guattari, and again, a true radical, I know we did Anti-Oedipus, some of us here, and, but really the radical of the group, more than Deleuze, my estimation, is inseparable from the proliferation of molecular focuses in interaction which skip from point to point before beginning to resonate together in the nationalist socialist state. Very important. It takes a step or a stage and expands it outwards, non-linearly. There's a continuity of the micro beyond its temporary or temporal placement before the state, since we may never even see a state formation that crystallizes. Yeah, a focus on microfascism can identify processes that have effects even if they don't creep to another stage. So again, Jack, through Guattari, is taking on the tradition, again, of stage theory, too, and the temporality of progress, right, versus regression. This is another very important moment here, that he's really displacing time. So, I mean, I'll leave it at that. We can certainly go back, again. But again, to me, this is an original work for many, many reasons. He has really set out new conditions to think this through, yeah, in many ways, using the best, in my estimation, of Guattari Deleuze's work of the Anti-Oedipus, and of course, A Thousand Plateaus, which was actually criticized as a work of nonsense by the French academic philosophy community for many years, and which it isn't at all. And in a way, it is a Thousand Plateaus is a confrontation with fascism, etc. And anyway, I like this too. Again, he goes through the features, and I'm going to turn it back to you, David, because this is not my thing here. This is yours. So, the three features of microfascism, I think, are very important for us to understand before going directly just to the cultural effects or to popular or even high culture, for that matter. To really think about this micro moments in terms of desires, in terms of fantasy. And this is where, even though he doesn't go to orthodox or traditional psychoanalysis, you can hear Lacan throughout this too, as well, throughout. You begin to really see, even though he doesn't mention, he's going to, in a way, very, very interesting in this regard too.
And that's, Michael, I wanted to just to ask you
Sure.
to extend this a little bit. He has this section on microfascism and trans-historical materialism, right?
Yes.
I think you've described quite a bit of it already. But Jack has participated in debates about Marxism and post-Marxism and what cultural studies relationship to Marxism is.
Right.
Marxism post-Marx is something like one of the titles of one of his more cited articles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you could just extend your analysis a little bit further. I think you're already talking about it, but like how Jack and how this work fits into or disrupts historical materialism, and how important it is, like the trans that he's putting in front of trans historical materialism. And just to follow on, right, like what you're already describing is the way that Jack puts the kinds of social relations that compose fascism before anything else. So before it forms itself into a state, before it participates in some kind of capitalism, before anything else, there is this or structure of fascism that relies on a couple things, patriarchy being one of them. But he talks about in the I just lost it, but somewhere he talks in the capitalism section, right? He talks about this being a patriarchal capitalism, not necessarily capitalist patriarchy, but a patriarchal, no, maybe it's the other way around. But it's the locution that indicates that patriarchy was there already, and patriarchy is the consistent thing, and patriarchy within capitalism takes on a specific kind of capitalist character of patriarchy, but it is the trans-historical nature of patriarchy and the desire to renew and restore, the desire to eliminate, that Jack's studying here, rather than the ways that sort of capitalism produces patriarchal or racialized articulations of class structures.
Right. I mean, I think it's an interesting question of Jack's relationship in this book and its theoretical movement to historical materialism. I think it goes, I think, and the term is right, that it is trans-historical materialism, if you will. It's still a materialism, obviously. The molecular, the elements, are there already. Desire is material. It's just not, quote, an idea. It has materiality with it, in a sense. And I think, I mean, this could be an ongoing discussion again. I mean, part of the problem, once again, with historical materialism, at least today, it has not taken into account, the major experiments with time, right, that have gone on. The temporality is very different post-historical materialism, if you will, right, in a sense. And we're beginning to see this. I mean, I had a conversation. I'm frightened because I had a conversation about my union today, and I had it on a Zoom. Nobody was there. I just had it on the Zoom. I was going to meet with a student, and the student hadn't showed up. I got a message from Zoom with an AI interpretation of everything that I talked on the phone about. So be careful, folks. I had this experience today, and I said some very private things. I mean, about, personalities, issues in the union, etc. So, in some ways. So to me, again, we have to really think this through very deeply. And where he's going, I like this very much. This quote he has on page 13: "Fascism is connective and networked," right? Very, very important to think about this, best understood through the language of mutation, proliferation, and molecularity. The movement here is not nameable as an organized coordination, even one as loose as the alt-right. So again, these things that we use, Antifa, alt-right, these terms are not adequate to a definition, to a new definition, if you will, towards a new definition of fascism, in a way, but as a strong mutating throng of self-affirming subjects. Very, very, very interesting. In other words, fascist individuals, even their rigid black hole interiors, right, do not simply end up the way through their personal encounters with fascist ideas and beliefs. You don't have to go to Charlie Kirk. I'm going to get in trouble now. They're going to really pick up on this, and the intelligence agencies. But anyway, you don't have to go to a Charlie Kirk meeting, whatever that thing is called, Turning Point USA, in order to do this. Right? This is, again, not really the personal encounters, but look, they become fascists through mimicking. This is interesting. Through desire, again, mimicking and inspiring others based on an already existing desire. What are we playing upon here, right? In a way. They may even be initiated, whether by an explicit act, that is red pilling, right? Or echoes of an archaic rite of masculine passage and differentiation from women. Very important. Again, this is very much what's going on here. Most of this happens below the usual threshold of political perception, right? Right? Very interesting here. Thinking of microfascism as a network of disconnected wholes is puzzling, even paradoxical at first blush. It warrants an analysis that attends to both the hyper-individualism, that is self-sealed subjects, self-sealed subjects, black holes, and the way these units compose in collective action, right? I mean, think about an analysis of TikTok, Instagram, all these forms that are out there now in terms of social media this way, what we would get, yield in terms of an analysis and maybe some kind of confrontation. Atomization is part of a composition of a more interactive body that holds the holes in place, but also increases their capacity for action, thus posing a profound danger to in the world. Right? It's ultimately the growth of a fascist formation beyond organized efforts, much beyond. And I think that, something about the right, if we want to use that very abstract term today, but certainly Trump and the people around him, if you want to go back to Cambridge Analytica, if you want to go to Rebecca Mercer and the Mercer money, et cetera, and how they pulled this off in a sense, is expert at using these kind of things in social media. They're really expert at this. And the left, in some ways, again, in general, even though tremendous media critics, right? Great analysis of everybody from Miss Sydney Sweeney to whatever cultural figures we want to look at, or whatever movements are happening, is tremendously behind on this question of desire and how one plays into it. And I think he's really showing this, in terms of the microfascism, how this is operating. So Jack is requiring at least a double or triple reading of this introductory chapter to really get on board of where he's going to go. And again, I think this is very important that we're spending the time with the introduction. Yeah, very, very. Yeah. I mean, in so many ways, right? Eco calls Urfashion eternal fascism. Yeah, means it's out of time. It's eternally with us. right? It's not just a result of patriarchal capitalism or capitalist patriarchy, so to speak, only, right? In many ways. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think this is very, 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 very solid as a very, very different approach to all of this. This to me is, again, I know I started here, come back full circle, an incredibly original work in contribution to these kind of studies and practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think John.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Great.
guess I haven't read too far into this book yet, but and I'm definitely willing to go along with the argument of transhistorical materialism to a degree. But I would sort of take issue with the idea of transhistoricalism in general, especially in the context of Marxism, where basically the heart of it is its historical specificity. So I'm gonna engage this book, but and that concept in general, for sure, and I'll go along with it. But I just wanted to point that out, I guess.
Fair enough.
For now,
Fair enough.
Only that it tends to universalize things that I think are potentially historically specific. That's all.
It'll be, I think, really interesting to keep that in mind, the contradiction between historical specificity and trans-historical trends or contexts, and how Jack, deals with that contradiction. Because it's something, this will be a fun book to read for that, because we know for sure that Jack is aware of that contradiction and will be able to speak to it. It might be a really interesting question for the 15th as well, when he's here to sort of articulate how he situates himself within that contradiction. I think that's really, really good. Because right, how does he deal? And I think he does. There's an attempt in this book for sure to situate our experience of microfascism and what would be an anti-microfascism and anti-microfascist care within very concrete networks. All of his case studies are very concrete. So that gets the relationship between the concrete and abstract is very central in Jack's work. He's designing concepts, but he's also, as an advisor as well, he pushes for concrete case studies to explore those concepts. And so I'm really interested to see, that's one of the reasons I wanted to draw our attention to this section.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to see what we make along the way of his materialism and his historical materialism and his trans-historical materialism, and how he navigates those contradictions to build that theory, I think.
If I could just go back to what Josh was saying, the principle of historical specificity in terms of historical materialism is developed by Karl Korsch in his book on Marxism and philosophy. He is the first to really articulate the principle of historical specificity, a major contribution, obviously, in a sense. The thing is here about the notion of trans-historical, this is the psychoanalytic dimension that is starting to come in, that the unconscious knows no time. This is an orthodox position of Freud. And, in some ways, Lacan, in his, especially in the 68 lectures on the other side of other side of psychoanalysis, basically said we still have no explanatory model why the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust occurred. I don't think we have an explanatory model either about the desire today of what's going on from Gaza to Rwanda to Sudan to all across the world. So in some ways, yes, this is a very good opening in a sense, the trans-historical versus what is history, what is historically specific. Yes, I like the principle of historical specificity because it gives rise to real material discussion that everybody can relate to. But again, this notion, we have to presuppose in some ways with the trans-historical that this is, again, part of the political unconscious, right? The cultural unconscious, all of these matters. So just to say.
That's a good point. That's a good way to put it.
As another,
That makes it easier for me too.
Yeah. That's the crisis in historical materialism in some ways. going back to Aronowitz's book in 1981.
Right.
I think, yeah. But I mean,
Yeah.
again, I'm not convinced, Josh. I'm with you in a sense.
No.
I'm trying
Yeah.
to say that there is a radicality here that we can take into account, because most people that are, Marxist logicians will look at a work like this and say,
Yeah.
this is not Marxist,
Right.
and I always like the phrase, it's more Marxist than the Marxist. And I think Josh
Right.
fits into that. I mean, well, Josh and Jack Bratich fit into this category. It's more Marxist than the Marxist in some way. So, but yeah, that's just maybe
I think it's a good point. Yeah,
an
for sure.
abstraction right now. But we should
Yeah.
see how it plays out. But yeah, these are very, very, I mean, interesting terms, right? Yeah.
And he's also, I mean, Jack is one of the reasons he was aware of Stanley's work and was on dissertation committees with Stanley and all that is because Jack was very aware of the and Sophia, this is hopefully going to speak to your question just a little bit. Jack is very aware of the tradition of orthodox Marxism and the reduction of economic determinism and economic class and all that. He's also aware of the better stuff, obviously, and is purposely like taking the move that he's picking up Marx and picking up everything that's valuable about Marx, while not being trapped in what would be the expectations of orthodox historical materialism. And then what we do within that, we'll see. But Sophia, to your question, this is all one of the reasons I asked it is this is about discerning debates and positionings within very widely considered sort of Marxist discourses. And as you might remember, Sophia, from our intro to media theory sections on Marx and Marxism, historical materialism is the name of kind of the philosophy of Marx. And as Michael and Josh were just going back and forth about, the situating of social phenomenon within their historical specificity, and therefore not studying historical phenomenon as universal things that happen all the time in history and studying them like that, but of situating phenomenon within their concrete histories is, and I'm not doing any justice to it, is really important to Marx and Marxism, how Marxism was developed. And so saying what Jack is saying explicitly is that he's taking a position against around historical materialism. And he's saying he's aware of the discourse and like participating in the discourse, but he thinks, as Josh said, that situating fascism and microfascism within the context of capitalism is his kind of point, is not what he wants to do. He actually wants to see the elements of fascism as a kind of historical context within which capitalism develops. So he's trying to reverse a little bit what would be the context and the specificity, right? So there's a trans-historical kind of fascist thing happening, and capitalism happens within that, as opposed to having to situate fascism within capitalism because we're good historical materialists and that's what we have to do. And then where I think Michael and Josh and I are trying to discern is how successful is Jack in doing this? If I'm doing justice to the summary, guys, how successful is Jack?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very radical question, and maybe one that needs, really a very elaborate understanding and greater, focal points to it. Is historical materialism as a methodology, right? Adequate to our times in terms of this object called microfascism and fascism as such? Is it adequate in terms of the investigation of that domain of objects that fall under the general category of a new definition of fascism? Right? Yeah, in a sense. Yeah. So this to me seems to be a very good question, going forward. And also the temporality of historicity, right? Yeah. What is the temporality of history here? right? Which is a very long debate that goes way back to history and nature, history and spirit, and all of these things too. So this is a very dense question, right, in a way. And the use of the term transhistorical, I don't like it especially, but it's kind of like transdisciplinary in a sense, right? There are disciplinary boundaries, there are interdisciplinary activities, but what would be the encompassing transdisciplinary that would be better as a model in order to understand things? You know, what is this use of the trans in this context, this prefix again? Yeah.
I guess I'm also wondering, like, why we're inscribing fascism only in capitalism, when it seems to me that you probably could trace fascism or fascist principles back, like even just to the principles of enlightenment, to a degree. Like here, I'm thinking about like Desaad, like content Desaad, basically. You know, this Lacanian idea of content Desaad together. And so I'm also, I don't know, I guess like this inscription too, I'm also just wondering a little bit about. I don't know what other people, or Michael, maybe you can speak to that too. And more generally, I can think about the question a little harder and ask it better too.
You want, Josh, like if we can skip around a little bit, and if you want, we can just take the couple paragraphs on his section on capitalism and see what he does there, and then maybe back up and talk about restoration and eliminationism after that. I think that'd be cool. Yeah?
Yeah,
sure. Good. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to read the first paragraph. So capitalism, section called Capitalism on pages 22 and 23. It's a short one. It goes like this. When it comes to capitalism, we need to acknowledge both its recent form as well as its longer-standing structure. First, as a persistent system of extraction and destruction, capitalism is closely tied to death-making. Really like a neat turn of phrase, death-making, and also important because, as Jack mentioned last week, death style, like death style fascism was supposed to be this book. So he was going to write a book called Death Style Fascism. This was the introduction to that book, and this ended up being the book that was published. So capitalism as death-making and how that relates to Jack's concept of death style fascism. As we'll explore in chapter 4, capitalism subsumes, systematizes, and expands death into a planetary machine, which Justin McBrien calls the necrocene or capitalocene. The capitalocene's conditions systematize a homicidal and suicidal sovereignty writ large in the so-called Anthropocene. In addition, Silvia Federici expertly traces the intersection of patriarchy and capitalism through a necessary figure for capitalism's origins in primitive accumulation, the witch. The destruction of women's knowledges and practices under the sign of the witch inaugurates the role for women within capitalism, which in some involves social reproduction without inclusion into wage relations. On a more conjunctural plane, capitalism's specifically neoliberal expression, so we're in the historical conjuncture, we're getting specific, right? Specifically, neoliberal expression sets the stage for contemporary fascism by being always already in crisis. Veronica Gago, Marta Malo, and Liz Mason-Deese posit that the crisis of neoliberalism will lead to the advance of social fascism on the micro-political plane. This plane includes religious fundamentalism and other feminicidal subjectivities that reinforce the divisions between the human and what is characterized as less than human, the feminized, racialized, and naturalized, that sustain necropolitics. The current context is thus, quote, a particular conjunction between neoliberalism that refuses to die and fascist forms that come to save it. Neoliberalism in decline thus unleashes and activates microfascism that is the nexus of gender, war, and death on women. There's 2 more paragraphs. I'll just finish it. Keeping in mind both the cyclical persistence and crisis-laden ruptures described by Gago and her collaborators, this book takes capitalism into account. not as the totalizing machine that determines forms of gender violence, but as itself an event in history within a broader patriarchal ordering and gender-based microfascism. So that's like the crux, right? Patriarchal capitalism, sure, but also capitalist patriarchy. The latter referring to a mode of patriarchy that reigned for some time and is now in crisis. This book's project displaces nation from the center of analysis to locate fascism in another material dynamic of sovereignty and subjectivity. The pre-modern, pre-liberal democracy lineage that operates primarily in the mode of gender. I mean, that's fucking... This project thus examines microfascism as marked by archaic and ongoing production of sovereign subjectivity. To that end, my project centers on the cultural domain as its own specific sphere of producing subjective formations, relational dynamics, and affective appeals. And I'll say for just really quickly, Jack's notion that we talked about last time of culture as milieu, as the milieu of the production of subjectivity, also like here becomes absolutely central. And what we think of then as culture as production of subjectivity, but for me, what I have a lot of trouble getting my mind around is culture as milieu, but like milieu produced how? Right? So like, it's not a milieu that just appears out of nowhere and starts producing fascism. But it's not, Jack doesn't want to talk about that culture as itself a strategic production, but I'm not quite sure how to understand materially the production of the milieu within which the production of subjectivity takes place. So I don't know, Josh, what do you think about, especially the last couple paragraphs there, where he really kind of wraps up what's context and what's happening within context, I think.
Sorry, it's hard to do Zoom on the phone. I get it. I think that's an interesting position, for sure. I think that what I was thinking about is just the way that desire is sort of inscribed in law, and sort of an imperative, like sort of a Kantian imperative, and on the flip side. So like, I guess I was just sort of thinking it in broader terms than the way that it's sort of set up here. But I totally think, yeah, I get it. I think the production of the liberal subject is really what I'm trying to aim at, basically. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Michael, did you want to jump in with anything?
No, I mean, I think this is very interesting. The section you went to, again, really raises the question of fascism, also in the pre-capitalist, pre-nation state formation. This is very interesting. Fascism didn't emerge in the 15th or early 16th century. It existed long before that, and you begin to see this in some of the return, in my opinion, back to the rereading of Antigone. The Antigone complex in Stiegler, the Heideggerian reading of Antigone in 1935, when fascism is so high, right in the moment, right, of the formation of the Third Reich and its legitimization, and of course Lacan, at the time of the Algerian War. So these things are historically specific, but they go back, pre-date pre-capitalist formations, in a sense. And I think this is one of the reasons that sometimes historical materialism, of course you can do a historical materialist reading of Antigone and situate it within, the trading possibilities, the conflict of state between the two brothers, the conflict between the law, as Josh was saying, and the law of the family, the conflict between the law of the transcendent, of really, in a sense, the transhistorical, because that's really what Antigone ultimately appeals to, is the trans historical law. So I think this is good to keep in mind. And you know, I looked at some of the footnotes here. I mean, I like going to the footnotes to see where it's coming from when he's writing this too, you know, in a sense. So he's reading Thousand Plateaus again. So he's really reading this through, you know, levels of plateaus. You know, again, this is a very well, to my opinion, a very well argued book, but at the same time, it's also this reading by plateaus, like the Deleuze and Guattari are doing, a very layered reading too. It's not just simply thesis, antithesis, right?
Right.
Reconciliatory synthesis. So yeah. So I think this is important to keep in mind too. Yeah, as we go forward. Yeah.
Jacob, what are your thoughts? I know last week you were thinking about, you brought up capitalism and how capitalism kind of gets short shrift in the introduction, and so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on it. If this kind of makes sense, or if it's short circuiting for you, or what you make of it.
Well, I think Michael did a good job last week stating that in what context that this book is written in. In some ways, I do like the way that Jack uses the term black holes, but in some ways, I do not like it. I like it because, like, if you talk to fascists, they don't really like each other. So, but it's like a weird type of respect also. But I think in some ways, a black hole suggests that there's such gravity to the desire, but I'm not sure if I quite agree with that. It seems like a lot has to be stripped away and a lot has to go wrong in order to allow for these. Yeah, in some ways it is a black hole. These networks where just going in, you have to have such level of abstraction. And that's why a lot of these right-wing spheres are so prolific online, I think. And then,
I love it.
Yeah.
No, please. I don't want to cut you off. Please.
And then going back to transhistorical, yeah, I think more anthropological research would push back on some of the historical materialist orthodox analysis. In some ways, when you suggest a historical materialist lens, that also strips the agency away from people. And if you look through the archaeological record, people do have agency, and you can go back and forth between periods of liberation and more authoritarianism.
Yeah. So like the two classic.
Can make history, but not of conditions of their own doing. Right? Yes, indeed.
That's it, right.
Well done. Yeah.
The classic criticism of Orthodox Marxism is being
Right.
too structural and not having enough place for agency, and then the return of agency is in the sort of relationship to the structures. It's fantastic. Do we want to talk? I kind of want to read a little bit about black holes, since the black holes are a really important. It's one of the concepts I wanted to talk about. And I think if we talk about how he begins to describe and define black holes, we can sort of start talking about restoration and eliminationism, and then we're talking through a handful of the most important concepts, I think, of this introduction. So if it's cool, unless anybody has anything else they want to jump in with real quick, I'll read just like the 3 paragraphs between 13 and 14 where he introduces this concept, which he'll pick up again in chapter 1 and use a number of times throughout the book, this concept of the black holes and what's going on here. Anybody have anything else they want to jump in with before I
I
read?
just want to mention one thing, and this is for Beryl in particular, but for everybody. If you go back and you read elements of anti-Semitism and the dialectic of enlightenment, the parallels are amazing of what they do there and what Jack is up to. And remember, this is 1944, not to privilege and say the Frankfurt School are the end all to be all, but the insights and the level of what they were thinking during this time is pretty amazing given where we are in scholarship today. And, it's just an incredible special group of people, intellectuals, that really were so insightful about almost everything. And as Foucault said, had I known Adorno's micrology, had I known the Frankfurt School, I would not have made so many mistakes. And again, this section, Elements of Anti-Semitism, could be read alongside Jack's book for a very deeper understanding of how deep the stakes are, right? And going back to what Josh was saying about the Enlightenment thinking too. What really happened here, right? In a sense, is progress just an illusion, right? In terms of temporality, these are very serious, still very serious questions, at least to my mind. If you're going to go about this philosophically, in many ways. So just to mention, this is 1944. They write this. Again, 47 it's published. And, we're talking, 80 years ago, 81 years ago, a text that still resonates deeply. Of course, Aristotle still resonates, the pre-Socratics, the Chinese Taoists, et cetera. But on the other hand, this is a pretty amazing work in terms of the question of desire, projection, delusion, right? And how these forces are mobilized. So I just wanted to add that to anybody that wants to, I'm always trying to look for these relationships.
I'll mention quickly before Josh jumps in that Jack, about a year ago, we were chatting about Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School. And he said that the dialectic of enlightenment should be required reading for the moment. So he's very aware of and engaged with the dialectic of enlightenment as a key text. For sure. Josh, were you going to jump in?
Oh, no, just concurring.
Well, Josh is on to something too before we go forward. And I'm sorry again, but I think there are many interesting things on the table we can come back to. Josh mentioned Sade and Kant, right? And Lacan's insight is that the regulatory, regulative ideas and the table of categories have already anticipated all the perversions in the Sadean universe. Right, which is very interesting. Another kind of almost, trans-historical approach too, in some ways. And also the failure of the Enlightenment, in a way, in some ways. We were never able to hold that regulative ideas and those categories up to complete scrutiny going forward, even though, as all of us know, after many years of studying this, scholastic aptitude tests, graduate records exam are all based on Kantian principles, right? This is dismantled, in a sense. If you know Kant, you'll get 800 on the MedCaps or 800 on the LSATs or close to it, if you can deconstruct all that. So, but anyway, I think these are very important things too, because in terms of desire, and going back to Sophia's back, Salo, as a film, this really exposed fascistic desire, right? And what's at the bottom of all of this? The Epstein, files are child's play compared to what was going on, with the Desadian universe, right? In some ways. But this still plays out all the time. And remember, and to be historically specific, I'm not again, I think this is very important. Pasolini does this film in 1975 during a major reaction against the Italian autumn of 1969, right? Massive reactions to these things. And he makes this film at this point. Yeah. So, so. Just a bit of film culture. I'm sorry. This is where I live a lot of the time. So
Love it.
Right.
Yeah, Sophia's very happy for the references. Anybody else want to jump in with anything that we've talked about so far? Any comments? Any, I don't know.
Well, we want
Anything?
you to go to black holes.
Yeah, we're definitely going to go.
Let's go to black holes. Yeah.
All right, before we fall into one. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'll read starting with the third feature of microfascism on page 13. I'll just do a couple,
Right.
like these 3 paragraphs. Beginning to describe what black holes are. The third feature of microfascism is related to subjective action, now defined less as an individual desire and more as coordinated operations. Okay, less as individual desire and more as coordinated operations, or what describes as the compositional realm. So the compositional realm, coordinated operations. Microfascism has a connective dimension where fascism forms a social body. For Deleuze and Guattari, what makes fascism dangerous is its molecular or micropolitical power, for it is a mass movement, a cancerous body rather than a totalitarian organism, end quote. This mass is neither uniform nor dependent on conforming subjects. Not dependent on conforming subjects, right? It is something more elusive as a coordinating and gathering force. It, quote, occupies micro black holes and resonates among them, acting on the masses through millions of catastrophes. It's not that individuals are formed first and then find each other in some sociological manner, although this is what social movement studies often presumes. As Guattari remarks, these black holes swarm and proliferate across the social field, which draw in and transform subjectivities. Desire is again central here, as the attraction to these networked black holes is already socially produced. And this, the next paragraph, the already existing desire is so important here. So fascism is connective and networked, best understood through the language of mutation, proliferation, and molecularity. The movement here is not nameable as an organized coordination, even one as loose as the alt-right, but is a roving, mutating throng of self-affirming subjects. In other words, fascist individuals, even in their rigid black hole interiors, do not simply end up that way through their personal encounters with fascist ideas and beliefs. They become fascists through mimicking and inspiring others based on an already existing desire. We said that before, the already existing in the cultural milieu as a production of subjectivity is so important here. Already existing desire. So it's not that like fascist media creates fascists. It's that fascist media connects into an already existing desire that's out there. Which, just for one more aside before I continue, is so interesting. Jack is in media studies. I'm in media studies, right? And a lot of media studies is, even behind its own back sometimes, a media determinist in its expression, right? Not just the liberal stuff, but a lot of the better cultural studies stuff still remains studying the ways media affects, ultimately, the audiences that are being studied. And so this, like, Jack's persistence in locating the production of subjectivity, not in like what media does to, but the way that media connects with a kind of social body that's already there, I think is so crucial and so important, especially within media studies. So already existing desire. They may even be initiated, whether by an explicit act or echoes of archaic rites of masculine passage and differentiation from women. Much of this happens below the usual threshold of political perception. Michael read that before. Just one more quick paragraph here, and then we can go further if we want to. Thinking of microfascism as a network of disconnected wholes is puzzling, even paradoxical upon first blush. It warrants an analysis that attends to both the hyper-individualism, the self-sealed subjects, and the ways those units compose in collective action. Atomization is part of the composition of a more interactive body that holds the wholes in place, but also increases their capacity for action, thus posing a profound danger in the world. What do you think? We can go further than that and finish the paragraphs if we want to. But this idea of sort of the fascist character being this self-sealed black hole, and yet these hyper-individualized, sealed off from the world around them black holes, finding a way to connect, to network, and to compose. And so both like the production of this black hole and then the composition of these black holes into something networked, I think is really fascinating. I'll give if nobody wants to jump in, I'll give a very quick little example of sort of a loosely connected thing. In my classes, I always do the history of sitcoms as part of the classes that I get to teach. And I always pause on All in the Family because All in the Family at this point, especially undergrads, lots of them have never heard of this flipping show anymore. They've never heard of Archie Bunker. Like and the conversation that it excites is largely a conversation of how was this so popular, because it's so egregious. And the humor, the jokes are so demeaning along gender, race, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, obviously, right? And I play, number one, I talked to them about how the show's popularity depended in part on Archie Bunker being read affirmatively and people enjoying Archie Bunker and saying it's just funny and experiencing it that way. I then play a clip for them of Carol O'Connor talking about the character. And Carol O'Connor doesn't mess around. Carol O'Connor says that Archie Bunker, it's an interview with Dick Cavett from the Dick Cavett Show. Dick Cavett says, Archie Bunker, everybody loves him, isn't that great? And Carol O'Connor says, it's okay, I guess, that people love that character, but he's not a lovable character. That's not the point. And Carol O'Connor then very quickly summarizes Archie Bunker. He says the tragedy of Archie Bunker is that he's a bigot, and his bigotry and his intolerance cut him off from the rest of the world. And he describes Archie Bunker as a black hole. He doesn't use that term, obviously, but he then describes the character as a black hole and says it's not a funny character. The tragedy of the character is that he is an intolerant bigot whose intolerance and bigotry make it impossible for him to connect and feel love and care and connect to the people around him. And so he says it's fine that people enjoy it, but that's the character. It's this. And so I then talk through with my students the way this audience sort of divergence between the audience that sees Archie Bunker affirmatively as a guy who's just telling it like it is, and it's funny to hear him do it, right? And the audience that my students are typically more a part of, the audience that says, Jesus effing Christ, how could this have been popular? And didn't anybody realize how racist this stuff is? And then try to negotiate like who identifies with what and who does what reading of this particular character. But it strikes me in this context that Archie Bunker is a really good example in Carol O'Connor's description of a black hole, right? Of this self-sealed character that won't let the rest of the world in. Sean, yeah, please, if you want to jump in, jump on in, please.
Well, I just wanted to say something about, because, you know, I'm old and I remember that show. And I also, you know, grew up in a family where, you know, there were people who you could say, well, that's sort of similar. And, but I recall, you know, this was the spring of 1970, spring of 1970. And I was there at the when they were building the World Trade Center, and the students had been killed at Kent State and Jackson State. And my high school is down on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And we marched, you know, we went on a student strike, and we marched down to the Wall Street, and we were right there. I remember I was standing up right next to George Washington there, the statue on the what was it, Sub-Treasury building at the time. I think it's a museum now, but it's right across diagonally from Wall Street. And I'm standing up there, and I see coming down Wall Street, I see the big crowd led by the guys in suits with hard hats, and the workers the steel workers from the putting up the World Trade Center at the time, and they were being led by the iron workers union leaders down Wall Street, and I could see them coming down the block. I'm standing right up on this pedestal there, and I see there's a police cordon, and it opens up and it lets the police in to beat up the demonstrators. Most of us were kids, and these are grown men iron workers led by their union leaders, right? And a lot of my friends got beat up, you know, it was a big fight. I was on the track team, so nobody caught me. So, but I thought that I always made a connection between that riot, which was portrayed all over America as like the hard hats beating up the hippies. or beating up this college students. We weren't college students. We were just like working class kids from a local high school who were the ones getting ready to be drafted, and we didn't want any part of this. So, but it was portrayed as like, oh, here's the working class beating the shit out of these like middle class students who are anti-war, which was a total fabrication. But that thing that was on the front page of Newsweek, that was turned into that sitcom. All in the Family was that sitcom of the so-called worker, who's going to beat up or mock, the peaceniks, or a woman or his wife or anybody.
Right,
But see,
right.
the thing that sort of irked me about this section, to say that Archie Bunker is a black hole. Archie Bunker is produced. Archie Bunker is socially created. I don't believe this black hole, like you're born in Archie Bunker. No, this thing is created. Those workers marching down to beat us up, they were created. They were instituted. And so the whole discussion of fascism, to me, and the reason that I'm here is because I'm looking for, well, first of all, the way that the people use the word fascism to describe our current environment at the moment, which I have some problems with. And I think that the term gets misused. But I think to make it ahistorical, in other words, to say that, well, fascism is not having to do with really capitalism. Fascism has existed. And what's the origins? Where are these black holes? What is this thing that is in the human character that is producing this kind of authoritarianism, which we now call fascism, but it's been here forever, and it's like, it's that to me is where the whole thing about Marxism and historical materialism, I don't really buy it. I think that there is, I think that there was another, well, at least in capitalism, in the era of capitalism, fascism has a specific meaning. It's a form of rule. It's a form of social control. And, it has a particular history, and people using the word fascism, you could say in America, I mean, you talk to black people in America, fascism, well, they were lynching and terror, you associate these things with racial oppression, and the whole history of the United States is based on this. Before the Germans, before the Italians, before any of this stuff was going on in Europe, they copied what was going on in the United States. So, that's a part of like when all these like younger leftists start talking about fascism, it's like, wait a second. What about our own country here? They didn't need fascism as social control in the United States. This is a particular characteristic of the United States. They had this kind of, they never needed fascism to sort of control and destroy socialist organizations or communist organizations or parties that were threatening the control of the bourgeoisie over the society. They didn't need it in the United States because they had the working class never constituted itself in parties or even national or labor organizations. They didn't need fascism in the United States. And because there's a particular history here. And so, but this is not even talking about the particularity of fascism, whether it's in U.S. history or even in the world today. This is to me, in my initial feeling, and I'm trying to keep an open mind. And Michael knows I have a lot of
Yes.
old-fashioned,
I love Lenin.
old-fashioned Leninist, Marxist Leninist kind of thinking here, and I don't think it's outdated or
Right.
irrelevant. I
Right.
think that there is something about this idea of fascism and making it like it's existed from time immemorial. And now we're just trying to understand its sort of psychological basis, which, okay, yeah, that's try to understand it. But I think there's a psychological or an emotional or a patriarchal kind of origin of this thing. But there's also this other thing about fascism as a form of social control that a ruling elite resorts to as a last resort to crush people's movements. And, I think that where this fits in with that. In other words, does this book, after reading it, is this going to give people tools to resist fascism, to intervene? If there, in fact, there is this trend in the United States, internationally, towards fascism, is this book giving people tools to resist, to intervene? And I'm just leery of, like, well, when I hear that the black hole, it's like, well, if people are born this way, like, what are you going to do? That's that it's a little defeatist to me. That's my initial approach, my initial thinking.
Yeah, I think, and Michael, if you want to jump in, I'll get out of the way in just a second. But I think, Sean, I think it's all really interesting. I think the Archie Bunker thing, I'm using Archie Bunker as an example. Jack doesn't. The idea so I really like the idea that the problem with using Archie Bunker, or like the problem with the concept of the black hole that you're pointing to, is it feels not just transhistorical, but ahistorical. Like there's no history to it. Like somebody just must pop out of the sky in this condition. And I think what we'll find is that that's not how Jack thinks about it. That what we'll find as we work it through, I think, not that it might not be satisfying, I'm not sure yet, but that, as Jack said last week, the production of that subjectivity within a cultural milieu, and understanding what's going on with that cultural milieu and what's going on with that production of subjectivity is, I think, the point of the book. So not to say that these black holes appear out of nowhere, but to try to understand how they are composed, how the subjectivity is produced, and then how the movement, if we could say that, is composed. The pre-movement organization is composed from the ground up. So like what I'm thinking, as you describe fascism's success in the US and the nature of the success in the terms, in sort of compositional terms, what I'm thinking as you say that is that it's possible, or the question to be posed is, was America's like composition of fascism effective enough so that like it didn't need to become a state form as crystallized as it became a state form in, say, Germany or Italy or whatever, because we were so compositionally fascist that the composition didn't need to form itself into a state, because it accomplished everything it needed to accomplish as a compositional pre-state movement. And if so, then the question is, what's up with the American personality structure, and why is it?
It's not a personality structure. It's white supremacy. It's the invention of the white race. It's not a personality structure.
But the question then, so
it's
the question
class struggle.
Right, but how does class struggle become part of an individual's actions and thoughts and assumptions? Right, like how do we find that class structure in the structure of the individual without a concept like a personality structure to understand the way that class ends up inside us, right? Which is one of Jack's points in making this a bit more universal, is at the end of the introduction, he makes clear that part of what we're looking at here is that we're studying a fascist context within which we are doing our study of fascism. And so like our own existence within this context can't be stepped out of. And there's no Marxist, Leninist, or any other methodology that's going to allow us to step out of fascism in order to examine fascism. We are in this context doing this study in the context, and our personality structures themselves are implicated, therefore, because we are produced within the culture that produces all of these black holes. So the question becomes, like, how do we understand the production if what's happening is that class struggle, if white supremacy is producing human beings who go out there and act on their ideas of white supremacy, then how does that structure of white supremacy become something that's part of who we are, part of our thoughts, part of our actions, and part of the assumptions and interpretations we make of what's going on around us? How does that compose in Jack's, how does it compose into something larger than an individual? Please, whoever was.
Sophia wants to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to add, just from an experience of living in Italy, how, I mean, that in itself I mean, that can just be applied to the argument at hand in itself, in the fact that the binary difference between, let's say, the north and the south of Italy is rooted in is rooted in history and cultural differences as we grow up and where we come from. Like specifically, I come from Napoli, so I've learned from living in Italy that the Milanese have are racist against the Southern Italians. They don't classify them as Italians, and I mean this is maybe a little bit off topic, but I think there is relevance to it in the fact that it's like having a binary difference and in the way that we're raised, the way that our traditions and culture is so seeped in Italian culture, and like and it's interesting too to visualize, you know, as a perspective from an American perspective, visualizing Italian culture when the Italians from Milan, let's say, like my colleagues that I know of, they see it in a different context than we as Americans see it, as a Southern Italian inspired, and they don't believe that Italianism is really inspired by the South. They think it's inspired by the North. So just, I mean, this is just perspective on like living and you know, living with Italians and Milanese and that disparity between the North and the South.
And if you say Africa begins south of Rome, right?
Right, exactly.
You know the scene in True Romance with Christopher Walken and Dennis Hopper?
Yep.
You know the scene,
Yep.
scene on the Italians and their origin? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
very funny cinematic representation of this. By the way, you know, Gramsci addresses this in 1925, the Southern Question, exactly what you're talking about, class composition and region in Italy. And Gramsci was radicalized in the Turin factories, right? Even though he came from, you know, Sardinia. Yeah, originally. Yeah, so very, very interesting.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
And Pasolini, by the way, did a very good analysis of male sexuality interviews in Napoli, one of his very early films, a documentary about Naples.
Yes, I've been dying to go on a Pasolini like kick, and I want to go through it.
Yeah, I know we came up earlier.
Yeah.
I just wanted to raise one thing, just a kind of proposition that is, I think, still relevant today. And going back to what Sean was saying and what we've been talking about, there is a book by Bertram Gross called Friendly Fascism, the study of American fascism. It's called Friendly Fascism, in which it talks about how liberal democracy is able to cover up these things very actively, you know, and of course the exceptionalism, right, always is brought up as the American case, you know, the melting pot, American exceptionalism, all these kind of things. The last thing on Americans' minds are class. They'll talk about rich and poor, but not class relations and class structure, etc. Or this distinction between the snobbery of Milan, right? By the way, Silvia Federici comes from Milan. Anyway, and you know, those in Naples, you know, and then those in Tuscany, the Florentinians, the worst in history in terms of their snobbery over the rest of Italy, right, in a sense, and even in relation to Venezia, right? So there's a lot there that you bring up, and one of
So interesting, and even in the dialect, if you listen to the
in
dialect,
the dialect, yes, right,
it's interesting.
which Gramsci wanted to study in terms of fascist appropriation, the relationship of language to fascism too. Well, how corporatist mentality, you know, an Italian corporatist mentality, i.e. Mussolini, appealed to those who only had regional dialect. And he distinguishes between the national language and the dialect and the international language to show who's prey to fascism. But I want to just go back to this whole question, and Josh brought it up, and I think we should explore it during this thing about, you know, what is fascism. And again, and I don't, you know, I really think that the essential philosophical question of our age, and for a long time, has been, why do people, you know, desire their slavery rather than their freedom? Why do people really choose to be enslaved, enchained, and rather than struggling for freedom? Which is still the ethical question, of which raises, again, questions about what you raised, David, about, you know, the milieu, right, etc., and composition. How does this come to be? Why is it that Sean is, you know, who's working class, right, is beat up, right, or you know, he's looking at hard hats coming at him of the same class background, right, in a sense, and they're fighting and one side's fighting for the war, right? And the killing of students, and the other side of the same class formation, if you will, right, are fighting against this or demonstrating against this. And, it's an old position about the police. The police, in a way, and this is always a great analysis, the policing of society, Donzelot's Jacques Donzelot's great study about, how families begin to police each other, right? How social services becomes a new form of policing, right? In a sense, in the 19th and early 20th century. But really how this milieu, again, is created in which people, what is the question, again, of desire to be enslaved rather than free, right? In so many ways. How does this take place? And this is a question posed by Spinoza, right? In a way, in the 17th century, and posed actively by Deleuze and Guattari, certainly Sartre in a different way. These were always these questions. So in some ways, I think that, again, going back to Jack's book and the influence, if you will, by the quote unquote post-structuralist, or whatever you want to call them, et cetera, this group of French intellectuals and Italians too, because Negre and others are very influenced by this work, this kind of work. How does this play out, right, in the sense of how do we become, choosing these kind of fascistic structures? We have lived through 50 years of neoliberalism now. And the best coming up is we're making fun of Trump every day, and we're trying to, passively fight, right, in a way. And, I mean, with all due respect to Mondani, right, Mondani, yes, it's an attitudinal shift, et cetera, but this is nothing radical. I mean, this is hanging out with the Soros kids and the, et cetera. This is a kind of, billionaire prep school kind of approach to social justice. Not to put it down in thing, but in a way, is this really a working class movement? Is this really a new organic, class, composition, right? Is this, speaking to in Marxist terms, new organic, class composition and new forms of capital? And, again, this, again, very important. Again, to me, the notion of the black hole, maybe it's not a great metaphor. He's taking it from Deleuze, I mean, from Guattari, who was, on many different psychedelics at times. So who knows what they're thinking about it. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, I mean, maybe that's where we do operate in some ways. I don't, yeah, in a way. I think what he's saying, Sean, just if I can go, and then please raise your finger higher. Yeah, let me know. Right, is that, I guess what they're saying is that somehow, at bottom, what they're discovering in this explorations in desire, and these are people that are working in experimental clinics, right? They're looking at group fantasies, etc. They're trying to put this together in terms of what is this desire. And one of the conclusions, if you will, maybe not a sealed conclusion, but that everybody has fascist tendency, right? Fascist elements, right, in a sense. And I think, again, you have to read the book relationally to the question of gender, primarily, number one. That's going to play out very actively throughout this. And Federici's book is a great study of this. Paulina Fortunato's great book on wages for work is another great book on these kind of moments of the gender question. Then the relationship to war, which he's going to speak about, which we have today. I mean, in case nobody, since Archie Bunker and the advent of the police procedural at the end of the 70s has dominated TV alongside action films, right? Everybody is a rogue, CIA or Navy SEAL that's on a mission somewhere, martial arts movies. Everything is about war. Really, in the sense, the new superheroes, etc. framed in this way. So we have to think about this too, and this hybrid wars. And then finally, this very perplexing and a very, very difficult question to answer: desire. Yeah, what is this? Right, in a sense, and how does this play out? And as Lacan said psychoanalytically, and I think he's right about this, is that we don't have an explanatory model, really, in a sense, about the concentration camps. We don't have an explanatory model of this extreme, position that fascism has taken up. Nor do we have an explanatory model of what, how, the right wing in Israel, right wing Zionism has taken up today. Really, where does this come from? Is it just social control? Is it just because they feel so impotent in their private lives? I mean, we don't know what, and again, I think it's also a question of looking at the genealogy of the will here too, since we live in an epoch of the will to power, right? The will to empowerment, the will to power, right? How do we build power and all these things? Where does this go? I mean, in a sense, as we explained. So please, Sean, go ahead. I'm sorry to ramble on here, but yeah.
You covered a lot of territory.
Too much, yeah. I can solve the air controller strike, or I can fly many planes at once. I'm just kidding. Right?
I just wanted to take issue with what I feel that you were putting forward as sort of like an assumption.
Yeah. Okay.
I just like to challenge a little bit.
Absolutely.
The idea that, well, I don't want to misquote you, but it was sort of like, why you raised the question, why do people want to be slaves? Why are so many people embrace their own slavery? And that's, I started to think about Margaret Thatcher telling us that, there is no alternative, because if people are really embracing slavery or have the dark hole within them, is that part of their dark hole? It's inside everybody that we want to be slaves. And I really take issue with that. I think that there are people probably born with a desire. It's sort of like some kind of desire to dominate or control. There's probably something there. But I don't think anybody is born with a desire to be a slave. And I would say that would be my basis for, okay, give me that and let's go from there. But if you're going to tell me that people are, well, we just have the black hole, we have it in us to be, some of it are going to be, be slaves. It's like, whoa, I really have to say, whoa, And the other thing is when they would ask this question to the robber barons back in the 19th century, when they say, how can you do all these things? Aren't you concerned about the working class? And they would say, I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half, So he wasn't talking about black holes and it's in them. He was talking about, well, I can control them. I can steer them. I control they don't have any money. If I'm willing to pay them to do the dirty work, because they don't have any choice, they're going to do it so they can live. Maybe that's another thing we're born with. People want to live and they do what they have to do to live. But that's different than saying we have the desire to be slaves.
No, it's not. No, the question is why are people choosing? And I'm talking metaphorically here too. I'm not talking that, people actually say, please enslave me or whatever, but they become slave to things that are not liberatory, right? That are not in terms of the development of the human being. Why do we have the politics we have is really a good question. Why isn't there a politics that's based on really, empowering the human being, making the human being, develop instead of always cutting into the human being? And why isn't there a reaction to this in a much greater way? I mean, the promise of Marxism was always for the new subjectivity, to create the human being that never really existed. And Marx was aware of this too. I mean, in some ways, he didn't frame the question that way, but this was a framing of the question earlier: voluntary servitude during the time of Montaigne, Laboutier is the first to raise this question of voluntary servitude, and then how it becomes, part of the 17th century capital. It's reinscribed by Spinoza, and then it comes up as a real ethical question today, in many ways. I mean, look at the athletes, for example. Look at the platforms athletes have. They never speak out politically. Versus that, and isn't this a question of desire? What would they have to lose? Some of these guys are, making $40-50 million a year to play basketball. Yeah, right. To play baseball. No question, no outcry at all about what's going on in Gaza, etc. Right? Everybody, and again, the as you said, protests only, right? Designer protests in the United States. Whereas in Italy, yes, they're stopping although the longshoremen in San Francisco have done a little bit of their job on the West Coast. So again, I think it's a very reasonable question about desire. I know it's complex and it's not easy to see. And yes, of course, people don't want to give up their means of livelihood. I've seen this in strikes. What are they going to do to us? Am I going to lose my job? First question they ask in a labor struggle if you go on strike, And, but again, it speaks in a sense, freedom is a risk, right? That's another thing that we've become conditioned to, being very risk averse. And this is exactly what Margaret Thatcher and, new forms of, fascism prey upon. The inability of people to they won't do this. They sit around David knows this, having known something about Madison Avenue. They know exactly how the consumer is going to react to the next thing. They're people that are highly paid psychologists to study this in terms of everything from behaviorism to cognitivism to associationism to do this. So that's where I'm coming. I mean, I don't mean to say that people, actually go up and say, I'm going to be a slave, I'm condemned to slavery. I mean, I like the Sartrean phrase. The condemnation we really have is condemned to freedom. And what a struggle that really is, in a sense. Someone that wrote against fascism, had a character said, I am my freedom, if you've read The Condemned of Altona, He casts it during the Nazi time in Greek tragedy, the tragedy of Electra and Orestes. Orestes announces to Zeus, the authoritarian, I am my freedom. And will take the consequences. So anyway, I'm I'm speaking obviously somewhat subjectively here, and obviously through a very passionate desire for that kind of freedom. But yeah, I mean, but I hear you. I mean, I understand this very well. That generally speaking, people are going to say, my experience, you've been in union struggles, Sean, I mean, people have a very hard time going out on strike. Look at your friend Roger, in a sense, what he went through in terms of pulling off a massive strike here in New York City during Christmas years ago, during the Bloomberg administration. So, but anyway, are they willing to really fight? That's really the question, I think, And again, he's trying to analyze this. And again, I know it's abstract to most, thing, but he's really trying to, I think, analyze this question of desire, right? What is desire, right? Is a very radical question. What does it mean to desire? It's like going to the therapist, and the therapist, you tell this is what I really, the therapist says, what do you want? So you go through, all the things that's on your wishes and your list and what you want to change. And then the therapist comes back, or at least a good psychoanalyst could say, what do you really want? Right? And that's always the question, right? And this is something. So
Michael, we've talked about this in terms of the labor movement many times, in terms of Stanley's notion of protest and resistance, and I'm sure an element of this that Sean's seen in your experience too. That there is a kind of desire among even strong labor organizations not to fight for power, but to be the protest and resistance against fascistic authority. And the desire, the expressed desire, the acted upon desire is to remain in a subordinate position to that fascist authority.
Absolutely.
Not to, for all the reasons, right? We could say for the risk and all that, but also for some other reason that's a little bit more hard to locate, that there's a desire within the organizations to prove that they are competent at protesting and resistance. And part of that proving of competence at protesting and resistance is that they definitely don't fight for actual authority. I've been through this and continue to go through it in the academic space, where at Rutgers, we have a couple pretty strong faculty unions who have proven they can go on strike for contracts that absolutely refuse to fight for any power on campus, to fight for any decision-making power over curriculum, over class sizes.
Right.
And we have there are some small victories that the adjunct union has won, trying to find seats on decision-making bodies along the last couple of years or whatever. But overall, it is a fight against the majority within the organization. It's a fight against the majority of people who absolutely do not want to fight for power, versus people who are confused as to why we're choosing over and over again to protest rather than try to put ourselves in the position.
And also going back to to Jack's triad here: gender, war, and death. These are all things that are basically based on power, right? And an analysis of power, of which Marxism, at least in my mind, has always been limited. Hence why, the Frankfurt School, hence why Foucault and others become very, very popular at a particular time. They want to analyze this in a very different way than just state formation and control. And let's face it, about quote unquote working classes, it's not all working classes. Please don't hear me as universalizing this, but in some ways, they voted for the Third Reich. They voted for Ronald Reagan. They voted for Donald Trump, right? In many ways, right? In a sense, these were people that really were not with their, quote, if you want to really say it, class interests, or that the class interests had changed so much that they're being fed compositionally something that is of a hope, right? In a different way. And, how do you explain this if it's not through, a new type of toxic masculinity? Not talking about the death warrior, right? This culture that has, again, been created, but at the same time, the tendency is within, Yeah, in a way, right? Yeah. So I don't know,
Sean, do you?
Well, how about voting for Rockefeller?
I didn't vote for him. I'm just kidding.
No, I remember I had a conversation with an old communist once, and
Yeah.
this is a guy from Spain, fighting at the
Right, with the anarchists?
yeah. No, he was a communist. He was
Oh, yeah,
he was
okay.
hardcore communist. And
Okay.
but he had dropped out eventually. So I asked him, I said, what happened? What was the turning point for you? Why'd you give up?
Right.
And he says, sighed. He said, because he was a New Yorker, from the
Yeah.
Bronx, lifelong
Right.
communist, And he says, when the people voted for Rockefeller for governor in New York State,
Right.
that was it for him. He says, my God, if people are going to vote
Right.
for the fucking Rockefellers after
Right.
Ludlow, after all this shit,
Right.
they're going to vote for him for
Absolutely.
governor. It was like, it's sort of like in line with what you're saying. It was like hugging your own, or your own
Right,
enslavement.
it's true. I mean,
And so it completely discouraged him, and off he
I mean,
went, to just do his own life, But
it's a crazy book, and it's a terrible title, but it's really This Way to the Gas, gentlemen. Right? Name it's a study, yeah, too, of this too, right? In a way, yeah.
But the thing is, like, how do you
Yeah.
get to that point? It's not the black hole. It's not something
Okay,
that
fair enough, John. I hear
it's
you.
the class struggle. You're losing, you're winning, and you make mistakes, and you step in,
Right.
you take wrong things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let me say, because it's after 9. I think that's a pretty good place to stop, actually, Sean. That the question of like the black hole not being something that like we're born with, but culturally we're produced. It's produced. Black holes are produced. People who, if we're using that term, it is produced in some way. So the question, I agree with you, Sean. The question we should be exploring is how. Like, We have to locate that culturally. We have to locate that materially. How historically we locate it, we'll see. But Jack is definitely locating the production of that kind of personality materially. He's not saying that people just drop out of the sky or were born that way. It is a question of how culture produces this kind of subjectivity. So we'll see. I hope you stick with it, because I want to see like what you make of the way that he tries to answer this along the way. And if you think it's bullshit ultimately, or if you think like he finds a way to keep this analysis material, even as he's expanding out of the kind of historical materialist sort of analysis that I appreciate very much. And I think is a really important check on what Jack is doing. And I think he'll, on December 15th, he'll probably see it that way as well. That like what one of the tests for the way that he's theorizing this is can he answer the questions that you're asking in a substantial and meaningful way? Because I think that these are not questions, of knowing Jack as well as I do, I don't think that these are questions that are outside of what he's considering or outside of what he would think is legitimate. Like how this actually gets produced, how people become this, especially if we're not going to locate it in a specific capitalist moment, or then how do we explain the concrete, the material production of this kind of attitude individually and compositionally, collectively, is definitely one of the tests that I think it's okay to put this book to, for sure.
David, if I could, a very good synopsis of where we were talking, or at least something that can lay it out in the first chapter again, is on page 17. That begins on the internet, right? The groupuscular, the composition, he's using Griffin's term here in the second paragraph at the end, and on collective action. But he has a whole thing of the main elements of archaic culture, right? Of where he goes through the gender dimension, the necro-political, right? Again, and the war context, right? And then he goes to the key features of micro-fascist culture, right? So I think this may help the discussion a lot, because he frames it, right, in terms of we're not, the notion of the trans-historical is also going back to archaic culture too. Again, this is not just capitalism that's doing this. This is the problem once again, right? I mean, yes, we can blame it all on the Tina syndrome. We can blame it on, the reinforcement every day of fire economies in New York City, the neoliberal order, the neoliberal expansion, etc. I mean, just think about what's going on globally. Everybody, I mean, look, Sean and I are on the same page here. We study the Russian Federation. We're against, the Ukrainian fascist moments, etc. But look what has been accomplished in the last year. You've got a Japanese fascist woman, right, in power in Japan, our main ally in the thing. Yeah, we have and then you have Syria, which was, again, basically a Putin, a satellite in some ways, or, part of that moment in the Middle East. Now the guy's visiting Washington, shaking hands with people. You've got, what is the deep state up to here alongside this, play of microfascism, right? In a sense, and how we sometimes very much misread, because we're again, the thing I like about Jack, I don't think he's imposing theory. I don't think he has, the imposition of theory, right? In a way, I like this about him very much. He's trying to open up, right, in this introduction, what the plan, the operational plan is of the book. And then, the next section, I don't know your plan here, but again, the autogenic sovereignty, which comes out of Evola, another great Italian philosopher, not so great, but anyway, Julius Evola was a major Nietzschean, right? Very, very popular with Mussolini, very, very, but much smarter than, Mussolini and most of the fascist philosophers, much smarter than Gentili in many ways. Evola was very smart, spiritual aristocracy. And this was another thing that played into this aspect that Jack doesn't really bring up, is this return of the religiosity, what that means too, in a sense. That's sort of left out of the equation of how this feeds again the micro-fascism. But anyway, I'm personally enjoy. I think there's a lot to be learned here, and I think it's a very learned book, and et cetera. And yeah, anyway, yeah, for me, yeah, well worth the effort and the arguments. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And Sean, to your point about what this book aims to do, there's a fun line at the end of, I think it's the end of the introduction, where Jack describes anti-fascist praxis as a preemptive strike and as an ongoing anti-microfascism. So however it comes out, he is working, this book is meant to be an exploration of what the fuck to do and what an anti-microfascist movement, composition, anti-fascist care, what that would look like, and how to think about as an action, as what to do as a praxis, is definitely the point of the book. So one way or another, we're going to get Jack's attempt to answer your question. And so if this is the theory we're working with, then what does it lead to for, if not solutions, then strategies, practices, thoughts, ways to address it, fight back, and establish alternatives. All right, it's like 9/11. So unless anybody has any,
it is kind of like 9/11 out there. Very well put.
And today is
good. That was a great slip. Yeah, but maybe it was conscious. It was good. Yeah.
And as you said, Michael,
it is 9/11 time once again. Giuliani was pardoned.
And as you said, Michael, today is the triumphant return of Al Qaeda to the United States. This time, being welcomed to the White House. So
yes, indeed.
Anyways, this is not since 9/11 has Al Qaeda made this much of an impact on American politics.
Indeed. Yeah, here we are. Yep, the November sunrise. Yeah, for neoliberal capital. Yep, indeed. The amazing thing about Deleuze and Guattari, I just want to say this about 1,000 Plateaus. I know it's a crazy book. I mean, I've heard this many, many times, etc. But the amazing thing is, it's a narrative that really wakes you up every day to a new plateau where you can really think through things in a very, again, I was mentioning to David before the class, and people that have some extra time, I don't have any time, so I don't sleep. I just watch movies. This new British TV series, Slow Horses, it is really
great.
Have you seen it, Beryl? It is really good.
Yeah.
And I'm crazy about Kristen, what's her name? Stewart, the actress who plays the mom, right? The head of MI6, MI5. Yeah, she's great. Kristen Stewart Thomas, I think. She's fantastic. And Gary Oldman is probably the greatest actor of his generation in some ways, in terms of the versatility. I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis can capture a scene, but man, Gary Oldman's really got it. I mean, he is magnificent in this. And in a way, it's an exercise in the deep state. It's very amazing about how deep the deep state really is, in a sense, right? How it's and the games that it plays in some ways. Yeah, to me. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just going to mention that in terms of micro-fascism's alive and well in Langley and in London, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
not so micro.
Right, exactly.
That's true. That's true. But they start with the micro. They start in the neighborhood, Sean.
It's macro-fascism right there.
Right.
All right. So I'll see everybody. I hope we get back together a week from now and we see everybody, and we'll pick up chapter 1. I mean, we've really only talked about the introduction. There's still a couple things: sovereign subjectivity, downsurgency. Couple things that we could talk about from the intro, but we'll dig into chapter 1 and see what chapter 1's all about.
And hopefully I'll see some people for Bernard tomorrow night on the Negro scene and exosomatization. I'm not going to subject Sean to that kind of vocabulary. Anyway, Sean, I wanted to ask, did you get any word from Sebastian or any feedback yet?
Got some feedback, but not for a month and a half. I haven't heard from him. He asked me to send him some more stuff. I sent him some more stuff and silence.
I'm going to interrupt you guys real quick to say I'm signing off. And
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Nice to
everybody.
meet you, Sophia. Enjoy Italy.
Thank you. Nice
Yeah.
to meet you.
Right.
I,
So yeah, I mean, we'll see what we can do on our end. Yeah, I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
I reread everything and I said, maybe I should rewrite it, but he hasn't told me to rewrite anything, that my
Okay.
proposal,
Yeah,
how I'm
Well, it was a
approaching
good
the
proposal. I
concept.
read it. It was a good proposal. Yeah.
Maybe it's not like,
Right.
I said, maybe I should make it more au courant, like, what does this have to do with now, the here and now kind of thing.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then I was just thinking, maybe I should just think about other publishers,
That's not a bad idea. You want me
just
to give you the names of some? I mean, PM Press might be interested.
PM, there's this OR thing, OR.
OR's okay. Yes. Yeah.
There's OR, there's this thing that
Right.
Peter's doing, Eris.
Harris is the London operation of Alex
Yeah.
Stravakaitis and Peter.
Peter said he would publish it, but
Okay.
but
I don't
then
know if
said-
you're going to get great distribution. That's
right,
part of the problem. You want someone to do distribution.
Is this a joint project that you're working on with Sebastian? Is this Sebastian from Victoria?
No, Sebastian Bunsen of historical materialism and verso books.
Oh,
Different
okay.
Sebastian, sorry.
A different Sebastian. Okay.
Yeah, different Sebastian. Yeah.
All right.
Well,
I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye, Leslie.
See you
Good to
guys
see you.
tomorrow.
Bye.
See you
Bye.
soon.
Bye, Beryl.
Beryl.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I mean, we can try to follow up. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be quicker, but I have to get this thing done,
I understand.
After Jeff died, Ted died, it's like I have to get this. I have to do whatever I can
I
to get
understand.
this done.
I understand. No, it's a great commitment. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So let me think about this too. I mean, maybe even monthly review.
Monthly review, I was thinking about also.
Yes.
Because they wrote, I don't know what you think about Domenico Lasordo.
I like
mean,
his
I know-
work. I mean,
I
he's
know-
a great
I know Peter-
historian. I
know
mean, I have
Peter-
issues, but I like his work. Yeah.
But Peter doesn't think his critique, because he has this, he's got this big critique about Western Marxism. That book, Western
Well,
Marxism.
Peter hasn't read the critique. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a way to revitalize Western Marxism in a way. You can read between the lines. The Lasorda is much more intense and much more subtle and deeper than just calling for, the end of Western Marxism, or that it's
he's read
Yeah.
the stuff. He's
Yeah.
read it. He's making, he's making, I think,
Yeah.
it carries.
Right.
He wrote what a lot of times I feel. It's like, oh my
Right.
God,
I understand. Yeah.
But anyway, that's monthly review. So I said, oh
Yes.
shit, that's like,
Yeah. Why not? Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't you, send out another email and we'll ask Panagiotis and other, comrades to put the pressure on him. Yeah.
okay.
Sebastian's scared
Are
of
you-
me, but I'm not gonna.
Are you going to the historical materialism
I didn't go.
conference?
Peter Bruno went.
Oh, it happened already.
That already happened. They
Okay,
were
okay.
there and they're back tonight or tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay. And you never told me what happened to
Who?
his name just popped out of my head.
We don't know what happened to him.
Oh, okay. You never
Nobody's
heard.
talking. It's all tight-lipped. I can't get an answer.
I wrote to him in April and he said he would get back to me, but he never did. So I don't know.
Yeah, your friend who stayed with you, right?
Yeah, he stayed with me. We spent a few days together in Rhodes.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I know he had some strange things going on with him, the sex stuff and, it was a little off the beaten track. No doubt about it,
Okay.
But, it's like, I thought that anyway, I was just concerned. So you don't know anything.
Yeah, I'll see what I
Okay.
can find out, but I mean, I haven't pushed it, but I did inform
Okay.
for a couple
Okay,
of
well,
times. And
yeah, I just
you'll be
wanted to
the
see-
first to know. I haven't heard
Yeah,
anything. And
I just want to know if
you
he's
know,
okay. It's like,
what's
it's
that?
pretty
I'm
much
sorry?
just, I just wanted to know if he's okay. It's
Yeah,
like, is he
exactly.
still, is he still
That's a good
alive?
question. Very good question. Yeah, good. All right, good.
All right,
Well,
well,
see you here, man. I mean, look, this is again theoretical stuff, explorations. It's, a guy, he's coming, not really out of the historical materialist. He's more out of media studies and Foucault studies and other things like this, and a kind of French turn, if you will, if we could call it that, which I think should always be thought through, in relation to Marxism and deepen Marxism, be an appendage, if you will. That there's many things here, that could be used, but that's my take on it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
well, when you say that reading stuff wakes you up to a new plateau, it's like, okay, I want to go to that new plateau also, so I try
Okay,
to keep an open mind,
cool, man.
even though it
Cool.
goes,
I'll
even though
do
it
my
goes
best to
against,
make it as explicit as possible.
yeah. Well, I
I'll do my
appreciate it.
best. Yeah,
I
of
appreciate
course.
it.
Good. It's
Okay.
great to see you. It's a shame about the Yankees. I was there for the last game. Please
Oh
tell
my
your other half.
God.
I was
Oh
very sad.
God.
I was there at the game.
She was so
Yeah,
disgusted.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh.
Me too. Yeah. They need new ownership. Yeah. Okay. All
All
right, Joe.
right,
Take care. It's
take it
great to
easy.
see you, man. Okay.
Okay,
Be
bye-bye.
well. Bye-bye.